Okay, let's get started. Last class before spring recess. So we'll get back into some of the challenges of evolutionary robotics today, but of course let's talk about the assignments first. Hopefully everyone got assignment 7 and 8 completed and submitted. Yes, more or less? Okay. All right, let's talk for a moment about assignment 9. So in assignment 10, you're going to brush off your Python code. So just to prepare for that and to refresh our memories, you've been working over the last few weeks on your bullet simulation. So this is where all the robot and behavior stuff is going to occur. And you have your Python code, which when you left it in assignment 3, you were evolving neural networks, and in the neural networks that you were evolving in Python, you had 10 neurons, and each neuron was connected to every other neuron, including itself, right? So if you remember in your Python code, you had this weight matrix, this 10 by 10 matrix, where every element ij in the weight matrix was storing the weight of the synapse that connected neuron I to neuron J. Right? Okay. In assignment 9, you're now going to be creating another neural network, but now the neural network is going to exist in the C code. So in this case, we're going to have a slightly different cognitive architecture, which means we're going to have a neural network which has a slightly different arrangement of neurons and synapses. So unlike the fully connected network that you had in your bullet code, you're going to be creating a neural network now that has 4 input neurons and 1, 2, ... through 8. 1, 2, 3, 4 input neurons and 8 output neurons. And you're going to have synapses that connect every input neuron to every output neuron. So we're going to have how many synapses in this neural network? 32, right? Okay, your brains are thawing out. That's good. We're going to have 32 synapses in this neural network here. What do the 4 neurons represent in this case now? Where do you think the values for these 4 input neurons are going to come from? The 4 touch sensors, right, which you created in assignment, which you just created in assignment 8. So those 4 binary touch sensor values, every time you go through client, move, and display, that infinite loop, that callback function is going to set those 4 binary values. You're going to grab them and stick them into the input layer of the neural network. You're going to update the neural network using that simple function that we used before in assignment 3, which we'll come back to in a moment. You're computing the values that are arriving at the 8 output neurons, and what are you going to do with those 8 values? You're going to send them to the motors, right? So we're creating in assignment 9 just a random neural network, so we're not going to be evolving the weights here, so we're just going to be setting the weights randomly. So at the end of assignment 9, you're going to have a robot that's jumping around at random, not unlike probably what you have now, but it's jumping around randomly. It's actually not jumping around randomly. It's going to move based on the sensor values. The only randomness left is going to be the set of 32 synaptic weights. And you can imagine what we're going to then do in assignment 10, which is you're going to dust off your Python code here. You're going to modify your Python code so that now the hill climber is not evolving a set of 10 by 10 synapses. You're going to just alter it so that now it's evolving a set of 4 by 8 synapses. It's going to send that weight matrix to your Python code, to your bullet code. Bullet will use those 32 numbers to label the weights here. Your robot will dance around for 1,000 iterations through the client move and display function. It'll move around, and at the end, you're going to measure what about the robot? The distance from the origin, right? So we're going to get one number, which is the distance or the fitness. We'll send that back to the hill climber here. The hill climber will create a new 4 by 8 weight matrix, send that across, get the fitness back, and around you go. Make sense? Okay, so let's just have a very quick look at assignment 9. So right at the beginning, here we go. We're going to define a matrix in C now, which is just a two-dimensional array of floating point values, right? So there's our weight matrix. And then here's the code that I've given you most of the code here for updating the neural network. And again, this is not unlike what you did in your Python code. Now you're just doing it in C. So if we look at this carefully, we see that the outer loop iterates from 0 to 7, and the inner loop iterates from 0 to 3. So this is a little tricky, right? Because the outer loop is iterating over the motor neurons, and the inner loop is iterating over the sensor neurons. And the reason why we do that is because we want to start with motor neuron 1, so I equals 0 in this case. We then are going to compute the value of the sensor neuron multiplied by the weight that connects sensor neuron 1 to motor 1. Do that multiplication. Then add to it sensor 2 times the weight that connects 2 to 1 plus the weight of 3 that connects 3 to 1 and so on and so forth, right? Which is what's going on right in here. Right, we're doing that multiplication here, and we're summing it over the 4 sensor values that are influencing motor 1. Once we've done that, we have 2 more steps here, which is to squash, in step 7 here, we're going to squash that raw sum to a value between -1 and +1. That's the activation function. Once we squash it to a value between -1 and +1, we're then going to re-expand it to a value between -45 and +45. Why that range? It's the range of the joint angles, right? The value that's arriving at the motor neuron is going to be the desired angle, right? Minus or plus. Right? Once we now have that value for the first motor neuron, we're still inside the loop here, so we've just computed the desired angle for the first motor. We send it to the actuate hinge joint function that you created in assignment 7. Okay, so all the way through in a line 13, we send the desired angle to motor 1. We go back, now I is equal to 1. We're updating the new motor command for motor 2, squash it, expand it to -45 +45, send that desired angle to motor 2, and away you go. Make sense? Okay, so we send our desired angles to our 8 motors. Bullet figures out how much force to apply to that joint to start to rotate towards that desired angle. We then update the simulation. Bullet updates the physics. Everything moves a little bit. We come back in here, and now the sensor values may be different, right? One of the feet may have come off the ground or come into contact with the ground. Do this calculation all over again. Send a new set of 8 desired angles to the motors. The robot moves again, and repeat and repeat and repeat. So now, every time you pass through this infinite loop of move and display, the bullet is moving and displaying the robot, and you are adding code that will update the robot's brain or its neural network by 1 iteration. Right? Update movement, update neural processing, update movement, update neural processing, and so on. Okay, so if you look at the text proceeding here in step number 5, this code is going to be embedded directly into client move and display. Where does it go? Well, in client move and display now, you should have, the moment you drop into the top of client move and display, you set all the 4 touch sensors, or the 8 or 9 touch sensors if you still have them. You set the 4 touch sensors to 0. That's step 1. Step 2, you now call step simulation, which is the function that actually moves all the objects. Step simulation also calls the callback function, and it will set the touch sensors if they need to be set. So after step simulation finishes, the 4 touch sensors may no longer all be 0. So the sensors have now been set. And then you have, at the moment, you have actuate joint after that point, right? So this code is going to go between step simulation and actuate the joints, because step simulation has to set the sensors first before we can propagate the values of the sensors down to the motors. Once we've done that, now we're using our actuate joint. Then we draw all the objects in the scene, go back to the top, clear the sensors, update the physics, set the sensors, update the neural network, update the motors, draw the scene, and around and around and around you go. Make sense? Okay. All right. Good luck. We have until Monday, March 14th for assignment 9. Okay. So back to the schedule. We're working our way through some of the open challenges in the field of evolutionary robotics. This is a young field. There's lots of important questions out there to which no one has a good answer. But we definitely know what the challenges are. In 13, 14, and 15 here, we're kind of looking at the issue of scalability, which we'll come back to in lecture 19 and 20. You've seen a lot of experiments by this point in this course where we have robots that do simple things like manipulate objects, or locomote, or perceive affordances in the environment, or discriminate between self and non-self, which are all well and good, but how do we scale that up so that robots are able to combine all of these competencies and evolve the ability to get around in the real world, right? This is an issue. If we want to do that, we're going to have robots that have many more than 4 sensors and many more than 8 motors, which means we're going to have a huge number of synapses, which is going to make things very difficult for evolution, right? We may have a genome that has thousands or millions of numbers in it, right? This isn't something you're going to be able to run on your laptop. So how do we deal with this issue of scalability? Well, one approach which human engineers and software engineers use all the time is modularity, right? Anytime we want to try and add or evolve some new function for a robot, we don't want to have to start from scratch or break all the existing functionality. We'd like things to be modular so that we can add new stuff without breaking the stuff that we already have. The problem with modularity, as we saw last time, of course, is thinking about thinking is misleading. It's not clear to us what the modules should be, right? We want the robot to perform function X, and we think X is made up of 5 subfunctions, and we try and force or evolve evolution to solve those 5 subfunctions. Those might not be a good partition of the function. Yes?
Do we ever see using multiple fitness functions that measure different fitnesses, like not just distance for a walker, but also whether or not the walker moves there in a way we kind of want, you know?
Absolutely, and that's known as multi-objective optimization, and I think we're going to see that. We're going to see that later in the course. I can't remember where. Multi-objective optimization, as we're saying, there's not just one objective or not just one fitness function. There may be more, right? Maximize displacement and do it in a particular way. We saw in the passive dynamic walker that they kind of tried to do this. There are better ways to do it, and we'll see that later in the course. Good question. Okay, so that's modularity. We're going to look at that. Today, we're going to spend most of our time in lecture 14 dealing with the genotype to phenotype map. So if we have a phenotype, which in this case is the thing which is producing fitness, right? So our phenotype is our body and our behavior put together. So it's basically everything except the genotype, right? If we have a 4x8 neural network, we have 32 synapses, so our genome has 32 numbers in it. If we had 100 sensors and 100 motors, we have 100 times 100. We have 10,000 numbers. Our genome has 10,000 numbers in it, right? That's the genotype to phenotype map, which is direct. Can we do better than that? We're going to look at that in lecture 14. Okay. 15, we're going to look at a different kind of genotype to phenotype mapping, which is kind of the standard tool used in the field, known as HyperNeat or HyperNeat, NEAT or HyperNeat, and we'll get to that, I think, after spring recess. Okay, so let's jump back to lecture 13 for a moment, which we almost finished last time. So just to refresh your memory, modularity is very important. Good coders tend to write modular code. Why do they do so? because if you have modular code, you can create independent functions and you can add new functionality to your code without breaking existing functionality, right? That's why in a lot of your classes we hammer on about object-oriented programming, refactoring, modular code, and so on, right? It's just generally a good idea. When we get now to talking about networks, like neural networks, we can talk about two different kinds of modularity. We can talk about structural modularity, where if we look at the network, we can actually see separate modules, which is useful because now we don't have every neuron connected to every other neuron, right? Which means that the number of synapses no longer increases quadratically, right? Number of sensors times number of motors. If we can reduce this a little bit, we have less synapses, which means we have a smaller genotype, which means we have a smaller space for evolution to search. It's one of the benefits of structural modularity. The disadvantage is every time we add a new function or we try and evolve a new function for our robot, we have to add a new module, right? Or evolution has to add a new module. So pros and cons there. We talked about functional modularity, which is you might have a structurally non-modular network. You might have a bunch of things connected together, but if you do it in just the right way, that network can fall into producing different kinds of patterns when it gets the right stimulus, right? So one network that is encoding more and more distinct patterns, and we've seen a few examples of that so far. Okay. But in this lecture, we're focusing on this issue of structural modularity. But as I mentioned, we don't want to try and come up with these modules because thinking about thinking is misleading. We may partition the function in a way that's not appropriate for the robot. Okay, so we looked at this experiment last time with the little Kepler robot that has to pick up these wooden cylinders and drop them outside the arena. We thought about if, as a human engineer or as a human roboticist, what are the ways we might think about partitioning this problem. We looked at, the investigators looked at 5 different cognitive architectures. So cognitive architecture, again, is the number of neurons and synapses and how they're connected together. We looked at networks A through E, which become increasingly sophisticated. You can see in D here, they manually created 2 modules, right? This one and this one. This module is in control when the robot's gripper is empty, and this module is in control when the gripper is full. What do I mean by a module being in control? It means that the the motors are controlled by these 4 neurons. When the other module is in control, these 4 neurons are in control of the motors. Right? But again, the human investigators have decided that these are 2 good modules, and this is a good way to partition the problem. So network E takes a while to sort of wrap your mind around, but network E is designed in such a way that it allows evolution to come up with its own modules. So just to refresh our memory, let's just look at this part here. These are the neurons that are competing to control the left wheel of the robot. And there are 2 modules that are possible here. There's the one that connects the sensors to this output neuron, or there's a second module, which is all the synapses that connect the sensors to this output neuron. So these 2 output neurons at any time can take over control of the left wheel. So they're 2 different modules. But evolution can decide which one takes over control of the left wheel based on the sensor values. And it does that using the selector neurons. So you'll see that there's also synapses connecting the sensors to this selector neuron and synapses connecting to this selector neuron. If the left selector neuron's value is greater than the right selector neuron's value, that's evolution saying, I want this neuron to control the wheel. When this neuron's value goes below this neuron's value, this neuron takes control of the left wheel, right? So evolution can figure out what these modules do by setting the synapses that go to the output neurons. And evolution can control which module is in control by evolving the synapses that connect the sensors to the selector neurons. Okay, so two possible states here, but also two possible states or two possible modules can take control of the right motor, or two neurons can take control of this action, pick up, or two motor neurons can control and trigger release, right? So there's four kinds of actions that the robot can perform. Two modules for each one, so we have 2 to the 4 or 16 possible states for neural network E. Make sense? Okay. Okay, so we looked at this last time, and not surprisingly, it's neural network E that tends to do a better job, right? So the figure at the top is our familiar fitness curve showing how well the robots do over time. So these are averaged over 10 runs for each of the 5 different kinds of neural networks. And they actually evolved the networks in simulation and then transferred them onto the physical Kepler robot, which is this idea of transferring from simulation to reality. Another open problem in the field, which we'll come back to after spring break. Okay. Okay, so is there a correspondence between the modules that evolved and the ones that we as human designers think might be useful? And the answer is no, and we're going to see why in a moment. We're going to see that the answer is no, at least for one of the evolved E networks that they looked at. In this particular evolved network, it didn't take advantage of all the 16 possible states. It didn't use all the possible, it didn't use all 8 possible modules. Module 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It only made use of 2 modules. So it's only the right motor in which the values of the selector neurons ever pass one another. So when this particular evolved network is in control of the robot and the robot is driving around looking for pegs, from time to time, this neuron will take control of the right wheel, and then this neuron will take control of the right wheel. In the other 3 cases, one of the 2 output neurons was always in charge of that action. Okay, so there's 2 modules here. Which 2 subfunctions did those 2 modules correspond to? Right? As humans, we might think, well, there's 2 kind of obvious subfunctions here, right? What does the robot do when its gripper is empty? What does the robot do when its gripper is full? Or maybe these 2 modules correspond to when the robot is driving around in the arena and what the robot does when it's facing a wall. That's another partition that we could think of, right? Which one is it? Mother Nature is always smarter than us poor humans. It's extremely difficult to figure out what 2 subfunctions these 2 modules correspond to. Here is the investigator's best attempt to try and figure this out. So we're going to work our way through this figure going from the top rows to the bottom rows. But let's start with the picture at the top here. So the squiggly line here shows the trajectory of the robot when it's controlled by this one evolved network. It drives around and it finds 3 of the 5 pegs, successfully picks up each of those 3 pegs, drives to the edge of the arena and drops them out, right? So you can sort of see, if you follow this, it's hard to see the direction, so either the robot did this and then went on its way this way, or did this and then went on its way this way. But at some point it had this peg in its grip, got to the wall, faced the wall, dropped the peg, and then carried on. Here's where it dropped peg number 2, and here's where it dropped peg number 3. So it got 3 out of the 5 right in this case. Not bad, not perfect, but pretty good. Okay. So let's have a look now. So the top row here, called mod, shows which of these 2 modules is in control of the right motor at what time. So the horizontal axis here is time as the robot goes around and cleans up 3 of the 5 pegs in the arena. And you can see that indeed it is switching back and forth between these 2 modules. So wherever you see a black dash here, that's where the two selector neurons for the right motor, their relative values passed one another. One became higher or lower than the other, and the other module took over. Okay. W to T here is what is perceived by the robot wall and target object. Is there a correspondence between whether the robot saw the wall or the target and which of the two modules was in control? Not really, right? If these were in perfect correspondence, whenever it was black up here, it would also be black down here, and wherever it was white here, it would also be white down here. So it definitely, these modules do not correspond to what should I do when I perceive a wall, and what should I do when I perceive the target object. So that's not a good way of partition. That's not what these two modules are doing. How about left motor? So black dash now corresponds to the left motor spinning, and white areas correspond to the left motor, the left wheel not spinning. Correlation here? A little bit, but definitely not perfect.
So sometimes, but then other times contradict it, you know?
Right.
It kind of looks like whenever it's white, it tends to be more black.
Right.
You know,
Kind of. Yeah.
But there's really no way.
That's it. So whatever these modules are, again, they don't really correspond with the movement of the left motor, which makes sense because these modules are not controlling the left motor. They're controlling the right motor. So again, we see a little bit more of a correspondence, but still not perfect, right? So these two different modules can control the right motor, but when any one of these modules is in control, they might spin the wheel or they might not. So it doesn't have to be a perfect correspondence, and it's not. Does one of these two modules here correspond to pickup behavior? Same answer as always, right? Not really. Okay. But you can see here when pickup is triggered, and then what's happening in these three periods here. So this corresponds now to the release behavior. What do these three time spans correspond to? It's holding the object, right? So at this point in time, it's found one of the objects. The output neuron that controls pickup fires, goes very positive. The robot does this, and the neuron that controls the release behavior goes low, which is inhibiting. It's basically saying don't release, don't release, don't release, don't release until this point, right? At this point, if we go back up to here, we can actually see that it's perceiving the wall in this case, which makes sense. So it's holding something, it hasn't released it, it sees the wall, and away it goes. Okay. Release, the switching of the release neuron also doesn't seem to correspond to one of the two modules, right? So no luck so far. Here are our 6 infrared sensors, which are the beams that give us distance information. Is there a correspondence between the modules in any of these sensors? Sort of, right? Again, there's kind of something there, but it's hard to wrap your mind around what it might be. Okay, LB is the light barrier sensor. So obviously when the robot is actually holding one of the three objects, the light between the two fingers of the gripper is broken and that sensor is firing. And that's the robot's way of knowing that it's holding the object. Again, no real correspondence between that and these two modules. Okay, A through H here correspond to, again, a way you might, as a human designer, think about partitioning this problem into different subfunctions. So the robot in A here is carrying the object and it's looking for the wall, or the gripper is empty and it's looking for an object. Again, these don't seem to correlate with what the robot, how the robot is actually using its two modules. So it doesn't correspond to A or B. How about C through H? Do you see any more correlation there. Do any of these human-defined subfunctions seem to correlate with the two modules? C is pretty close. Yes, kind of. Again, kind of. See something. Do you see either do you see anything, a wall or an object? That's what C is. Not really. H is kind of close, but again, there are places where it's different. So we know that there are these two modules that are being used. There's a certain set of sensation. There's a certain combination of sensor values that trigger this pair of selector neurons to switch between the modules. So this neural network is saying, oh, there's a particular situation that's occurring right now, and I should be using module 1 to solve that problem. Or not. I should be using module 2 to solve this other problem. We don't know what those two problems are, but the fact that network E is more useful than any of the other networks suggests that modularity is useful in this case. There is an advantage for coming up with separate modules and dealing with different situations using different subnetworks. They don't correspond to what we thought, and it's very difficult for us to figure out what those situations actually are. Okay, so let's actually analyze this network a little bit more. We've seen this before. We're going to take this evolved controller, now put it back in the arena and expose it to a huge number of situations that were not observed during evolution. How do they do this? Well, they take the robot, they drop it back into the arena, and they place it at 180 different angles. And they also put it at 20 different distances from the wall. And they do so with the gripper either being already full with an object or empty. So I apologize for my math here. Should be 180 angles times 20 different distances times these two cases. So they're going to reevaluate the evolved neural network 7,200 times and see in each of those 7,200 trials, does the robot do the right thing or not? And we can see that for these 4 networks here, they measure the number of times that it does the right thing or the wrong thing. There's a whole bunch of cases where it's kind of hard to say whether it did the right thing or the wrong thing, but generally speaking, networks B and E make fewer mistakes than A and D. I don't know why neural network C is not on here. Okay, I'll have to ask the authors. This is like Randall Beer's minimal cognition plots that we saw when we were thinking about affordances and distinguishing between self and non-self. Here's a visualization of all these situations. So now in each one of these plots, each pixel corresponds to one of these 7,200 novel conditions. We have the 180 angles, or the 360 actually, down here. So they actually did 360, not 180. Okay, 360 different angles. And here's the distance that the robot was from the wall. So 0, 0 down here means the robot was 0 units away from the wall, so it was right next to the wall. And an angle of 0 means it was facing the wall right on. This would probably be whatever, 180 to the left, 180 to the right. Yeah. Okay. And then we have the 4 situations here, which is how close or how far it is from the wall. And in this case, so how close or how far it is from the cylinder. And then a white pixel means neither pickup nor release was triggered. Gray is trigger release behavior, and black is trigger pickup behavior. So when the robot is close to a cylinder, its gripper is empty, and it's facing the cylinder dead on that very specific condition, it picks up the the object, which is what it's supposed to do. Right? Out here it doesn't, because it's right next to the cylinder, but it's facing 180 degrees away from it, and it closes its gripper, it's not going to grab the object. Okay. Similarly, when it's close to the wall, and its gripper is full, and it's more or less facing the wall, now it makes sense to release the object. Right? Okay. So here's one evolved controller here that, at least in these 7,200 cases, never made a mistake. Down here, we can see that there is a second evolved E controller that does make a few mistakes. So this is correct, this is correct, this is correct. In this case down here, the robot is facing the cylinder. It's close to the cylinder. Its gripper is full. And as it rotates and detects another obstacle on its right, it releases the obstacle that it's currently holding, which is not what it's supposed to do. Okay? So it made an error in this case. However, if you pay attention to this area here, I'm going to flip back and forth between two slides. In this plot here, every black pixel shows that this evolved controller experienced that condition during evolution, and every white pixel says it never saw that condition during evolution. So why did it make these mistakes?
Never saw that condition. That was a white spot.
It's a white spot there, right? So the gray triangle there corresponds to white in this, right? So it never actually saw that condition during evolution, right? This is one of the costs that we incur when we use an evolutionary approach. We can automate the aspect of generating adaptive behavior, but we can't prove or guarantee that the robot is always going to do the right thing when exposed to novel circumstances. This is probably the biggest open challenge in robotics in general, right? However we create adaptive robots and we want to deploy them out in the real world and be in close proximity to humans, we want to try and make sure that the robot is going to do the right thing even when exposed to novel stimuli. Right? Still an unsolved challenge in robotics. Okay, so just to sum up our discussion of modularity here, this experiment was a success because it demonstrated a particular approach to evolutionary robotics where the robot determines which sensor states are experienced during evolution, and it doesn't experience every situation. It's free to choose, right, based on how it evolves. Whether a behavior should be divided into modules or not. So we just evolve for some fitness function, and if it's useful for evolution to break that fitness function into separate subfunctions, given the right kind of neural network, it will do so. What the network should do when those different subfunctions apply or those different perceptual states exist, evolution can figure that out as well. We don't have to tell it, do this when you're in this situation, and do these kinds of things when you're in this other situation. It figures that out on its own. Those are determined by the weights that connect the sensors to the selector neurons. I'm sorry, that's the sensor to selector neuron synapses allow evolution to decide what sensor states trigger switches between the modules. Right? It could have been when the gripper is full or empty. Do you have different modules for those two situations? But as we saw, at least for the one evolved controller, it's not clear exactly how it's doing that, but it does do that. And then when a particular module is in charge of one of the motors, the sensor to output neuron synapses dictate what the robot tends to do when it's in that state. Okay, so a nice approach to automatically creating modular networks for our robots, right? Be nice to be able to automatically create modular code. This is something that you learn as you become a better coder and software engineer. Here, we're showing an approach where we can use evolution to do this automatically for us for robotics. Okay, that concludes, I think, lecture 13. Any questions about that before we move on to the genotype to phenotype map? No? Okay. Okay, so the next open problem that we're going to tackle in evolutionary robotics here is we want to evolve more complex robots. We want to have many more sensors and many more motors, but we don't want the number of synapses to scale quadratically, right? If we have 100 sensors and 100 motors, we don't want to necessarily force evolution to find good weights for 100 times 100, 10,000 synapses. Can we do better? Well, we can if we address the genotype to phenotype map. So just to remember, the genotype is like the blueprint, the thing that contains all of the numbers or all the parameters, and those numbers help us to construct the phenotype, right? In our case, usually the robot. In most of what we've been looking at so far, most of the phenotype is actually fixed by the human investigator, and then a small part of the phenotype, just the synaptic weights, is under evolutionary control. In the remainder of this course, we're going to see more and more of the phenotype placed under evolutionary control. So as we're going to see actually starting today, we're going to see some experiments where not just the synaptic weights, but aspects of the neural network as a whole, and the body is also placed under evolutionary control. Okay. The mapping that you've been developing in your projects is a direct mapping, right? You have 32 synapses, so you have a genotype that has 32 numbers in it. It's direct because each element or each number in the genotype codes for just one element of the phenotype. There's a few spelling mistakes in these slides. You'll notice that with the red there. Okay, so a direct mapping is nice because it's simple, but it has this problem that if we scale up the complexity of the phenotype, the number of numbers in the genotype goes up quadratically or even worse, right? So we don't want to do that. So we're going to look now at a different genotype to phenotype map, which is indirect, and it's indirect in the sense that now each number in the genotype, we're still going to have a genotype that's a collection of numbers. Each number is now going to code for, or it's going to influence 0, 1, or more elements of the phenotype. Okay, so to build up an idea for why this is useful, let's have a look at this cartoon robot over here to the right. So we could, of course, use a direct mapping here. We could count up all the arrows in this cartoon, and however many there are, that's the size of our genotype. That's the number of synaptic weights we need to evolve. But we can see that there are different symmetries here. So we probably want to have symmetries in the neural network as well. So how would we encode this in an indirect mapping that would take into account these symmetries? Think about our discussion of legged locomotion here. Right? Are there certain synapses here that should have the same value, should always have the same value? We might not know what that value is. We'll let evolution figure it out. If every synapse here has different values, it's unlikely that the robot is going to produce a smooth and rhythmic and symmetric gait like walking and trotting and cantering and so on.
So every leg is going to have probably going to have a similar set of values.
Well, that's what we're thinking about, right? We can set all of the legs to have the same value, right? So let's just look at this synapse here. So it's bidirectional, but let's just think about one of the two synapses here. We could allow these 4 synapses to, we could just take those and put them as 4 numbers in the genotype, and evolution will come up with different values. Evolution might eventually come up with numbers in which this and this are similar to one another, and this is similar to one another, which will produce what kind of movement? Trotting, right? So that the 2 diagonal legs will move together and the other 2 will move in antiphase. We could take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 numbers, put those in the genotype, and now create an indirect mapping where the first of those 5 numbers labels this and this and this and this synapse. The second number labels this synapse, this synapse, this synapse, and this synapse, and so on. Right? So now we have an indirect mapping where any one of these 5 numbers influences exactly 4 elements in the genotype. If we did that, what kind of behavior would you get? So each of the 4 legs has the same set of synaptic weights, which means that whatever the sensors are in the feet and the leg, they're always going to move the motors in the same way.
Depending on how it starts,
Yep.
it's just going to either, like, if all the legs are on the ground and seeing the same thing, it's just going to do the same thing. Like,
Exactly. So if all the 4 sensors, if all the 4 sets of sensors in the 4 legs all get the same sensation in the first time step, you're going to get pronking, which is this, right? Okay. If they don't all get the same sensor information, you may not necessarily get pronking, but you'll get something that looks kind of like it. Right? So in this case, we can see a robot that has lots of kinds of symmetries. And if we're evolving for locomotion, symmetric gaits tend to be useful. They tend to be more energy efficient than the silly walks, right? So there's an advantage here. There's 2 advantages here. First of all, we can compactify our genome. We don't need to separately represent each synapse in the genotype. And we're also biasing evolution towards solutions that we know tend to be useful. We'll see that idea again coming up in the next lecture. Okay. What if we were to take all of these numbers and encode them as a set of numbers, and then say the numbers here are the same as the numbers here? So that's another plane of symmetry we could enforce. What's that going to do?
Well, if the robot were to go forward,
Yeah.
then both things would go forward.
So
they go forward in reference to them, so it wouldn't move at all.
Could be. So the numbers are the same. So again, it depends on what sensory information they get.
Yeah.
But each module here, each segment of the robot is going to respond in the same way to its sensory stimulation. That will probably bias it towards the worm, right? So a worm, actually we're going to see another worm in a few slides that does exactly this, right? Each segment does the same thing, and if each segment is experiencing the same sensory information, but displaced in time, so the front segment experiences a particular sensation, then the next segment does, then the next one does, those segments are going to react to that stimulation in the same way, one after the other, and you get peristaltic locomotion or the inchworm movement. Right? So again, we can compactify the genotype and bias it towards certain behaviors that we want. We also get another nice development, which again is modularity. Right? So if you created this creature in your physics engine and evolved it to do something, and then plugged in a third segment that had the same form with the same synaptic weights as segment 1 and 2, you wouldn't break the function that you already have. You'd still get inchworm locomotion, now with a 6-legged creature rather than a 4-legged, or an 8, or a 10-legged creature, or a 12-legged creature, right? Because it's modular, we can change the body of the robot and not break the evolved locomotion pattern that we already have. If we had a direct encoding scheme where we just evolved all of these numbers independently and then added on a third module, we'd also be adding on another whole set of numbers for the new synapses, and we have to re-evolve those, and we'd probably break whatever the robot was already doing. So an indirect genotype to phenotype mapping also buys us some of the benefits of modularity. Okay, so that's just to kind of motivate this idea. So now the reading for today is again one of my older research papers here, where I introduced a particular kind of genotype to phenotype map, which is based on development, and we'll come back to that in a moment. So this particular genotype to phenotype map is based on our mapping, which is a genetic regulatory network. So in your DNA, you have a whole bunch of genes. When those genes are expressed, they produce a protein. That protein diffuses throughout the cell and also through the nucleus. And some of the proteins that are produced by this gene influence the expression of other genes. And Genes turn each other on and off, and that pattern of turning each other on and off, that genetic regulatory network where genes regulate each other's behavior, dictates how a single cell grows into an adult human, in our case. Where have you heard this idea before? A gene turns on, diffuses a protein, influences another gene. Sounds kind of familiar. Well, this happens in biology, but it's something we just talked about. We've talked about many times. Hidden neurons are neurons in general, right? This sensor neuron turns on, this foot comes in contact with the ground, and it influences the value of this neuron, right? There's a very interesting parallel in nature, right? So inside here, you have a whole bunch of elements that are influencing other elements in a network arrangement. Inside the nuclei of every one of your cells, there is DNA, which is made up of modular units, and those units, when turned on, influence other units, right? So Mother Nature seems to like this pattern of creating networks of switches, right? Why that's a universal design pattern, that's a big unknown in biology. Okay, so that's the basic idea of what we're going to look at, what I'm going to show you in a moment. So I'm going to show you this genotype to phenotype map that I developed when I was a PhD student, which is based on that idea. So now instead of having just a matrix of numbers, which represent the synapses, I'm now going to show you a genotype that encodes a bunch of modular units that when they turn on, they turn on and off other units. And by doing that, they cause a robot to develop or grow. So we talked about direct mapping. We just talked about an indirect mapping. I'm going to show you now a developmental mapping, which is a particular kind of indirect mapping, where one element in the genotype now is dictating not one or zero or more elements of the phenotype. It's now dictating how the phenotype changes over time. So a good way to think about this, a good metaphor, is all of the genotypes we've looked at so far are blueprints. It's a fixed thing that has a fixed set of numbers that tells you how to build a static object. A developmental mapping and the genotype phenotype mapping that we all embody is more like a recipe. Do this, then mix these two pieces together, then expand this piece. So it's a set of instructions that dictate how to change something into something else. In our case, it's how to change a single-celled organism into a fully formed adult organism. In the developmental mapping that we're going to talk about now, the mapping dictates how to change, as we'll see in a moment here, how to grow a robot made up of these cells from one cell into multi-cells, into a collection of multiple cells. So again, here's a screenshot, here's a snapshot of an evolutionary run during one of my experiments, and you can see that these robots are evolving, so we're showing one after the other, and each one of them is also developing or growing, and it's growing. You can see the growth programs are different, which lead to different behavior. Here's a particularly high-fit solution. I don't know why. Here's one that has bilateral symmetry. The left side looks like the right side, which is kind of nice, but it doesn't go anywhere, so this one is tossed out of the population, and evolution continues on its merry way here. You can see in the population there are multiple variants of this solution that seems to be working. And away we go. Okay. The white and black coloration here is showing me something about the local neural structure inside these cells, and I'll show you another video of that in a moment. So here we're watching the bodies of the robots grow as dictated by the genotype. The neural networks are also growing inside these robots. Okay, any questions before I go on?
Why is the recipe idea different than a blueprint?
So a blueprint dictates how to build a static structure, right? A bridge. This bridge has this length, this weight, this height, so on. It's static. A recipe is giving instructions for something that is changing over time. Add this, change this, grow this, mix these two things. That's the metaphor here, right? A blueprint metaphor is for any genotype that dictates a fixed phenotype, right? So in your case, when you set the synaptic weight, that's it. It's set for the robot as it does its thing, right? It's a blueprint. If instead we have a genotype that says duplicate this neuron into 2 neurons, connect it with a synapse, and the weight of that synapse should decrease over time, the genotype is now dictating how this phenotype should change over time, right? It's a recipe rather than a blueprint. Make sense? Okay. So here's another pair of videos. I just showed you how to use this genotype to phenotype, or how I use this genotype to phenotype map for evolving things that locomote. I took the exact same genotype to phenotype map, and I took the exact same genotype to phenotype map and changed the fitness function and changed the environment a little bit and tried to evolve object manipulation. So here the robots are trying to evolve to grab this object and lift it. Turned out that was pretty difficult, so I made things a little bit easier. I put this object here up against the block. So now the robots are kind of evolving to push or roll the object up against the block. They're not doing a great job, as you can see here. But the reason I wanted to show you this video is these robots that you just saw evolving, you could see how the body was changing. Here's exactly the same video, but now I'm going to strip off the skin of the robot, so to speak, and you can see that the brain inside is also growing and changing. So back to the recipe metaphor. Each of the small spheres here is a neuron, and these little gray lines that you see here are synapses. The colored lines show synapses that connect some sensor neuron to some motor neuron. So when a robot has some of these colored lines, as you can see, it actually moves. You can have a synapse that connects this neuron to this other neuron, but if those neurons don't attach to a sensor or motor, who cares what they do? They're not influencing the movement of the robot. Okay, so we have a genotype to phenotype map that's now dictating how the robot changes over time. Well, how does it actually do this? Here's my little cartoon to show you the genotype. So if you go inside my code, you'll see exactly like in your code, the genotype is just one long string of numbers. But how those numbers are translated into a phenotype in my code is very different from how they're turned into a phenotype in your code. So these long set of numbers, that's represented by the thin blue bar here. And then inside that set of numbers, there are particular numbers that say, I am the beginning of a gene. And the next 7 numbers dictate how that gene works. So evolution can, by changing the numbers in this raw string of numbers, evolution can create, modify, or delete genes that are embedded in this long string of numbers. Right? This, again, is not unlike our DNA, where you have a lot of DNA, but only certain parts of the DNA actually code for functioning genes. What all the rest of the DNA does is still an active area of investigation in biology. It used to be called junk DNA. It was thought that that DNA does nothing, which was always a silly idea, right? If nature doesn't want it, it'll get rid of it. Turns out that junk DNA is not junk DNA. But for our purposes, let's just think of it that way, at least in my experiments here. So we've got a long set of numbers. Some of those numbers are just junk DNA. The rest are actual genes that do something. What do those genes do? Well, we start by taking the genome itself and embedding it into the single cell. So the moment we're about to grow the robot, we inject the DNA into that cell. And then these genes start producing transcription factors. And a transcription factor is a particular kind of protein that affects other genes. So that's represented by the little arrows here. We have the DNA. Some of these genes turn on, others are turned off. The ones that are turned on start to emit this transcription factor, which diffuses throughout the sphere and then can diffuse into neighboring spheres. And each sphere has an identical copy of the DNA, exactly how each one of your cells has an identical copy of your DNA.
But each cell now has a unique cocktail of different transcription factors, which means that in different cells, different genes are on and off. So every cell making up the robot has an identical copy of the DNA, but the state of the DNA or the state of the genes may be different. Some are on, some are off, which is, again, exactly the same case in our DNA, right? You have an identical copy of your DNA in every cell, but certain cells have certain genes that are expressed, and in other cells, those same genes are not expressed, which correspond to your different cell types. So in your neural cells, in your neurons, there's a unique signature of genes which are on and off. In your heart cells, there are also other genes that are on and off. It's that combination of on and off genes which dictates cell type. Okay, again, that's just a bit of an aside. We've got identical DNA in each unit making up the robot. Some genes are turned on and some are turned off. Some of them, when they are turned on, are producing transcription factors which influence other genes. Some of those genes that produce a transcription factor, it doesn't attach to other genes, it attaches, quote unquote, to parts of the phenotype. Some of those genes produce a protein that causes that cell to grow larger and split in two, like you saw in the video. Other genes, when turned on, produce a transcription factor that causes a neuron to split into two and a synapse to connect them together. Another transcription factor attaches to a synapse and detaches it from one neuron and causes it to grow into a neighboring sphere and attach to a neuron in that sphere. So we've got genes turning each other on and off, and as they do, they're influencing the phenotype and causing the robot to grow in a particular way. It's like,
Do you have any genes for pruning neurons or cells?
yes, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of transcription factors that kill off neurons and synapses and so on, right? So all aspects of the phenotype here can be grown, modified, or deleted. Okay, so back to this idea for a moment of the genetic regulatory network. We can represent the fact that A, when turned on, also tries to turn on gene C, and by an arrow here. And if B connects to C in such a way that whenever B is on, it produces a transcription factor that tries to turn C off. This is now starting to look really familiar, right? We have excitation and inhibition. When we're talking about genes, we talk about enhancement and repression. This is terminology coming from two different fields, genetics and neuroscience. But it's basically Mother Nature doing the same thing, right? She's come up in both cases with ways of creating networks where any elements of the network, the behavior of this element is a net effect of how it's being influenced by other elements in the network. Right? So what's really going on in this long string of numbers making up the genotype is the numbers are dictating which genes attach to which other genes. Do they try and enhance or turn on gene C? Do they try and repress or turn off gene C? Yes? Okay. Now, remember, we still have a string of numbers. Now let's come back to the evolutionary side. I haven't said anything about evolution yet. I've just told you what happens when you have this DNA, when you have this a particular genotype, and how it produces a particular phenotype. We can now use the same mutation operators that you're using. So we got this long string of numbers, pick a few of those numbers, and randomly change them to other numbers. So the mutation operator is exactly the same. But the impact on the genotype is different now. Depending on which numbers you change, you may actually kill off a gene. So you may change a number that used to say there's a gene here, and now the new number says there's no gene here. So it becomes junk DNA. So we can delete genes in that way, which adds some more neutral structure or junk DNA. The inverse operation can also occur if we mutate this number, which doesn't say anything. Now that new number says there's a gene here, so we've created a new gene. If the mutation falls inside the body of an existing gene, we can change the function of that gene. And what is the function of a gene? It's the kind of transcription factor, the kind of protein that it produces. So if we mutate gene A, we may disrupt its influence on C, and now it might actually influence B, right? We're in essence changing the wiring diagram of the genetic regulatory network. Some of these genes produce proteins which affect the phenotype directly. They cause the body to grow or the neural network to grow. We may also change that. So a gene that causes one of these spheres to grow may now change it, so now it causes the sphere to shrink. Or now it influences a neuron rather than a sphere, or a synapse rather than a neuron. Right? So again, we have mutation, which can now add, delete, and modify genes. We add an additional mutation operator, which can also add or change the length. So we can take our long string of numbers, cut it at a random place, pull the two pieces apart, and put 3 or 5 or 11 new random numbers in there. We could take a string of numbers, grab two places in the genome at random, copy that piece, and put a second copy somewhere else in the genome. These are all mutations that also occur to biological DNA. So now the length of the genome can also change over evolutionary time, which is very important, and we'll see why in a moment. In your case, your genotype doesn't grow in size, right? It's always 32 numbers. Okay. Here's a third experiment, which we're going to analyze in a little more detail. Okay, I'm going to show you 2 videos here. These are both taken from the same evolutionary run. This is the ancestor, and I'm going to just show you one robot here. This is one robot growing. This is evolved, and this was evolved early on in the evolutionary run. The task here is to push this very large object as far as possible. Again, Mother Nature is always smarter than we are. Evolution has figured out that I always put the block in exactly the same place. So instead of reaching out and pushing the block, you get something that locomotes blindly forward. And as it does, it manages to push the block a little bit. So this thing got a little bit of fitness, not very much, but better than not touching the block at all. And eventually here, it'll carry on its merry way. Okay. There should be something very familiar to you in this video. What is it? How is the robot locomoting? Peristaltic motion, right? So this was one of the first modes of locomotion that Mother Nature discovered when organisms invaded the land. I got really excited when I saw the results from this evolutionary run because, again, Mother Nature has hit on this common solution of peristaltic motion, which we'll come back to again. But before we talk about the peristaltic motion here, I want to show you the great-great-great-great-great-granddaughter of the robot I just showed you. So this is a descendant of that robot that you just saw that evolved in the population many generations later, about 100 generations later. So this one has obviously has different DNA. It grows similarly to its ancestor, but also different in important ways. Again, Mother Nature has figured out that I always put the block in the same place, so it says I don't actually have to locomote to the object. I can grow a front appendage that just reaches the object. I grow a lot of mass, and I tip forward, and I apply a lot of force and rhythmically push against the block. Again, it doesn't do a great job, but better than its ancestor. Tell me about this descendant robot. What is similar and what is different from the ancestor?
So obviously the basic motion of the appendage is very similar to or the same as the ancestor, but the ancestor could not push with much mass. So
Right.
that was remedied by having a really large thing in the back.
Exactly. So that's new.
And
Yeah.
also, the thing in the back prevents it from sort of moving off in a different direction.
That's it. So this long side spur here is kind of stabilizing it, making sure that it doesn't rotate away from the block. So this long front appendage, right, looks almost or acts almost identically to the ancestor, right? There's still this wave-like motion, but now this wave-like motion, peristalsis, is not being used for locomotion. It's being used for object manipulation, right? Peristalsis in simple land-based animals was used for locomotion. Peristalsis is now used in humans for helping you to swallow solid food. Right? Mother Nature over and over again repurposes existing phenotypes, existing functions, existing structures for new functions. We actually mentioned this evolutionary mechanism towards the beginning of the course. Anybody remember what it was? So evolution here is exploiting a previous adaptation and repurposing it for a new function. This is the idea of exaptation. You see this all the time, exaptation. You see this all the time in nature. The bones that make up your inner ear that allow you to hear, those were originally bones in the jaw of reptiles that allowed them to crush prey, right? So ears were not created from scratch. Mother Nature, again, quote unquote, discovered that those particular bones in the jaws of reptiles would actually vibrate when there was pressure waves in the water or sound waves in pressure waves in the air. And that vibration could be useful, right, for mammals. Okay, so a great example here of exaptation. We only have a few minutes left, so let's just set aside the genotype to phenotype map for a moment. We'll talk about why this mapping is useful for us as evolutionary roboticists when we come back after the break. Let's finish with this. So where did this peristaltic motion come from in the first place? This is a cartoon of the front appendage of both the ancestor and the descendant. Turns out that both of those robots has exactly the same neural network that evolved in the appendage, and it works as follows. The left-hand side here, this is the anterior tip, the tip of the appendage, and this is the posterior tip, or the part of the tip, base of the tip that attaches, the base of the appendage that attaches to the main body. Evolution has found a solution, a recipe that embeds one touch sensor, the S's, in each node, and a single synapse that connects a touch sensor to the motor in the neighboring sphere. Right? So we didn't draw on all the edges in this cartoon, but there's one, 2, 3, 4 synapses here, 5 sensors, and 5 motors. This robot exists in a physically realistic environment. So when it grows, most of the spheres are off the ground. And because it's a physical simulation, these spheres have weight. So they start to fall down to the ground. And based on the relative sizes of the spheres, Mother Nature has figured out how to grow these in just the right way that the tip comes into contact with the ground first, which causes the anterior touch sensor to fire first, which sends a signal to the motor just behind it, which causes the tip of the appendage to rotate upwards. The combined mass of these two pieces pulls the tip down, and now the second sphere comes into contact with the ground, which causes this motor to fire, which tries to pull up the front two spheres, and away you go. Right? So you get a traveling wave from the anterior or the left in this picture through to the posterior, the right side of this figure. You get a traveling wave from anterior to posterior, which applies force going in the opposite direction, which gives you either locomotion or force against the object. Okay, remember our discussion about embodied cognition, right? Evolution is exploiting the fact that when the robot moves, there is some sensory repercussion. And if you have just the right body and just the right simple neural network, you get a useful behavior here, right? Peristalsis. There's no timer here. There's no central clock saying you move, then you move, then you move. This sequence, this timing emerges from the fact that the robot is embodied in just the right way, right? So embodied cognition is the basis, many of us believe, for higher and higher levels of intelligence. Here we're using evolution to find the right kind of embodiment for the behaviors that we want. Okay, I think we'll leave things there. You will have a quiz due tonight. Have a good spring recess. Assignment 9 is due the Monday you get back. We'll see you the following Tuesday.